Do you know anything about Travis Smiley and Cornel West and their rap on Obama?
Well,
My next guest, another old friend, Nick Weschler. Good morning to you, Nick.
good morning, Michael.
You know, the question I want to start off with is, what do you do for work? I've seen you at tree sale, plant sale. I've seen you at the Heartland Cafe. I know you're good friends with one of our biggest fans, Hannah Marcus.
She's my business agent.
She's your business agent.
Yeah.
She does a great job.
Yeah.
So what do you actually do for work?
I'm a child development specialist. I work for a big organization. It works in Illinois and around the country called the Ounce Prevention Fund. And we design programs for early childhood education to try to create opportunities for young children growing up in poor environments to close the achievement gap between rich and poor kids, to give poor kids the same opportunities that middle class and rich kids get.
Well, that's a whole topic we're going to have to explore with you some other time, because we're going to talk a little bit about the history of civil rights and housing in America post-World War. There was a place I heard about. I don't know much about it until I read a little bit about your history there. Is Levittown, Pennsylvania, and it was kind of people who'd come back from the war and got a little dough, and they got their place in the suburb. So why don't you give us a little brief thing on Levittown, and then I'd like to talk some background and go into what was going on in our country in the 50s.
Sure.
Because a lot of those issues are still with us today.
They are, isn't that terrible?
Too bad.
Yeah.
Right.
So Levittown was the dream of a family, the Levitt family. The father was a man named Abraham, and with two sons. And the sons were sort of entrepreneurs and young geniuses. They're sort of like the high-tech people from Silicon Valley now, dropping out of high school, dropping out of college, and making a fortune for themselves. And they became developers of communities. And what they came upon was that you could mass-produce housing, and you could perfectly plan a community. And if you replicated the same houses over and over again, you could make more and more money. So what they really were capitalists trying to optimize the opportunity that they had in front of them. And they created designs for perfectly planned homes. So they were planned, the landscapes were planned, the houses were planned, and it turns out that the social fabric was planned as well. And because they were in it for the money, and because of their belief system, which was mainly driven by money, they figured they would make more money if they excluded people of color. And this was during a time where there are a lot of different ways of excluding people and segregating housing in America, as well as every other aspect of America. But in housing they had realty confidence, where different realtors would join together and decide not to sell to certain people based on their beliefs or their religion or their skin color. And that was really what was happening during that time, as a way of controlling who came in and who stayed in the communities.
So it was all white, but was it all Christian, or were there Jews?
No, they allowed Jews, but it was all white. And there was actually, they had some Puerto Ricans, they had some East Indians. You just didn't have Negroes there. And they had a great way of controlling the environment. The Levitts produced a list of rules for people living in there that told you how you had to mow your lawn, how you had to keep your flowers in a certain way. You could only do laundry on certain days. You could only use a certain kind of laundry dryer outside. And then the last rule on the list of rules is that they agreed not to sell premises to be occupied by any persons other than members of the Caucasian race. So what you had was institutional racism based on the owner's whim. And this is how it really operated. And it started this way before the war, when they first started building housing. And then they saw great opportunity, as you said, after the war, with the GI Bill and vets coming home needing a place to live. So that's how that happened.
Let me just ask you briefly, you know, in Chicago we've heard and we've seen, we know about the Pullman community to the south, which was an intentional community for people who built Pullman cars.
Right.
Any similarities between these two?
Well,
I mean, one is way back, but it was an intentional
Pullman was
community.
a company town, and it had a lot of the same aspects that the owners controlled it, and actually had to go to work every day and work for your wages and then pay the wages back to the landlord.
Company store.
Yeah, when you lived there. You know, the similarities is that someone had a master plan, and there was a great deal of control, both in Pullman and in Levittown, in any of these intentional communities. And it just depends on what your belief system is about, what the control's about.
Levittown, where is it near?
Levittown is about 30 miles northeast of Philadelphia. It's right on the Delaware River. So it's about an hour and a half from New York City. about a half hour from Philadelphia.
And did people commute to various places, or did they?
They had to commute because there was no industry in Levittown. So they worked in Trenton, they worked in Philadelphia. The reason we got there originally was because it was a big steel mill, Fairless Steels, about a half hour away. The history of my family was one of political activism, going back several generations. My grandmother, Eva, was a revolutionary, an anarchist in Russia, and was arrested as part of the revolution against the Tsars in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and was imprisoned in Russia, in Ukraine, and was smuggled out of prison days before she was going to be shipped to Siberia by her comrades. And she was taken out of the country. She wanted to come back to continue in the struggle, but her comrades said, you can't do that because your brother was just murdered and they'll murder you. So eventually she and her mother hooked up again, and they ended up in the Lower East Side of New York, where they worked in the sweatshops and lived in tenements in the Lower East Side. On my father's side of the family, my grandmother in England was a suffragette and was on the streets making speeches for women's rights and voting rights in England. My grandfather was he was supposed to be a rabbi. He was training to be a rabbi. And then he got smitten by the political movement and became a furrier and an organizer for the Union. They eventually migrated to Canada, where my dad was born. So you have both my mother's family and my father's family coming out of a history of social activism. So they were raised in a community of change, of activism. And that's how their young lives were. They met when they were both students in high school. My dad was a year older than my mom. And they were involved in all kinds of student organizations and taking up struggles for what students cared about in their schools. Things like lower food prices in cafeterias. You still have that today. There's nothing changed. Now we're struggling about better food in cafeterias. Lower taxi fares so the students could get to schools. And as they grew, they became more involved in a political movement. And in the 30s, in that time, the political movement was an acceptable lifestyle.
No, the communists were a party. There were a lot of other various Trotskyists, right. And it was like America has a really strong history of left activism. It really influenced things that benefit people now who wouldn't be caught dead even associating with that.
And during that time, as they are now, the leftists were very active in struggle, and people who were not leftists appreciated what they were doing to support their movements. So the famous story is there's a picket line, and the cop beats up someone, and someone picks them up, and they said, well, that was a communist. Well, that wasn't a communist, that was a guy who helped me get up after the cops beat me up. So that was the tradition around America of political activism that my parents were a part of. They eventually became members of the Communist Party, and along with that, they became targets of the FBI because there was a period of McCarthyism.
Yeah, I had a roommate, Davy Wellman, when I was at Berkeley, and his dad had been.
Knows him well.
And I'm sure his dad had been head of the CP in Michigan, and had fought in Spain in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And Davy told me stories, about being followed around by the FBI and being questioned by the FBI, and just the, I was aware of the McCarthy period. My dad, who was not he certainly knew a lot of people who were progressive. He probably would be called a liberal Democrat, but he would not buy beer or anything from Wisconsin during the McCarthy period. Right. Tell our listeners a little bit about what the McCarthy period was.
Joe McCarthy was a senator. I think it was 1950 he was elected, and maybe he was along the line of the Tea Party, only worse right now. And he saw communism as the greatest threat to American democracy. And what he did is he went about a systematic way of creating fear amongst Americans that there was an effort to destroy democracy, led by the Communist Party. And he kept haunting people around the country and getting people's lives destroyed by sending FBI out, people losing jobs, losing homes, or losing relationships. And it was eventually done in by his own evil deeds. It was what they called the Army McCarthy hearings in '54. It was revealed that he had been lying. Basically.
He lied a lot.
Yeah. So what your friend Davy's father, Saul, experienced is what all of our families experienced at that time. And it was a time of terror in the United States. If you had beliefs that were socially active and questioned the authority of the United States and some of the decisions that they were making. So it was common in our own family that the FBI would frequently visit my father's workplace. He worked in the factories at that time. And the family joke was that whenever we saw my father coming home with his toolbox, we knew that the FBI had been to work and he'd been fired. They would come and harass people. They would talk to neighbors. People would lose jobs. And there was a sense of always being watched. There was always a sense in families like Davies and my family that there was a secret that young people had, because you could, you could lose your life or your livelihood if people knew you were socially active or a communist.
Another thing that came up in that period, and it's on my mind because I was just in Kansas, but it was Brown versus Board of Education. And maybe you could share a little bit about that. I basically, I always, most recently there's a book, What's the Matter with Kansas, and there's a movie, and Kansas it seems like it's always at the center of controversy. I was just in Topeka following my son's band, Twin Peaks. They were playing out there. And I went to the Capitol and I took pictures of John Brown with his arms outstretched, a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. Kansas was certainly a place that where the Jayhawks would fight the bushwhackers from Missouri. Missouri was pro-slavery. It was a slave state. Kansas had been, people had rushed there to make it so it wasn't a slave state. Later on we have Brown versus Board of Education. More recently we have all this abortion crisis going on. Tell us a little bit about Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah, Brown versus the Board of Education was the legislation that was designed to equalize education. And up until that time, and if you want to think about Chicago right now and the charter school movement and the turnover school movement, think about the parallels here. The theme in America was that it was separate but equal. That kids could go to a separate school, but it would be just as good as the school where white kids get. And you're laughing because there was no such thing as separate and equal. It was separate and unequal, and that's a part of what we're experiencing here in Chicago with the schools. So now, 70 years later, what's changed? Not that much. But that legislation said that the schools had to be integrated because separate was not equal. So that's basically what that was about.
We're talking with Nick Weschler. This is Michael James. You're listening to Live from the Heartland Show on WLUW 887, Chicago's Sound and Lions. You can get earlier editions, and you will be able to see this one in a few days if you go to youtube.com/heartlandmedia. There's a lot of rich material, and we encourage you to do that. Nick, one of the things that what happened at that time was, Little Rock, Arkansas, and integration. The kids trying to go to school, and you and I probably remember the scene, people spitting on kids. It was just wrecking havoc. But it was also happening in the North, that there was whole questions about integration and where people could live and their rights as human beings in America, a democratic country supposedly. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Levittown, when you went there, and what happened there, because you were there when the color line got broken.
We were. My folks moved from the Bronx, New York to Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1953. Levittown was just being built. We were some of the pioneers there, which meant that there were several houses built right around my own house, but a lot of houses being built. One of William Levitt's idols was Henry Ford and the production line. And he adopted that style of building houses, and he had an assembly line of building houses where they could build 80 to 100 houses a day by workmen going from house to house doing the same movement in each different house as they went along. So it was really like being a pioneer. There were no roads, there were a lot of dirt roads at that time. But the one thing that was clear is that it was for whites only, and a person of color could not buy a house in Levittown. Because my parents' history, they knew how unjust that was. And because of their social activism, they looked for like-minded people in the community, and they gravitated towards the group of Quakers, the American Friends Service Association, because those were the most progressive people in the community. They got involved in community life. My mother joined the Human Rights Commission in Bucks County. My father joined the Democratic Party. They made friends with the Quakers. And over time, they were involved in many different discussions with these people about the unjust segregation and what could they do about it. Over a number of years, people would meet, they would talk about it, and they would say, well, does anyone know a Negro family that would want to come in? Where would we buy a house for them? How would they buy a house? And this went on for several years of discussions. There was no master plan to do this. Then they met a family. Actually, they met a family that was looking for a home because the family was growing. They lived nearby, the Myers family, Daisy and Bill Myers. And their history as Negroes was not too unlike my own family's history as communists, is that they were outcast in America. They grew up in segregated America. Daisy grew up in West Virginia, so she felt racism and segregation personally. Bill grew up in York, Pennsylvania. He felt it a little bit less. But if you're a person of color in America, you can't get away from what America delivers to you. Just like if you're a person of politics in America, you can't get away from that. They were looking for a house, and as it happens, the house immediately adjacent to my house in Levittown had been vacant for 2 years. There was a recession in 1957, and this house had been vacant for 2 years, and the man was desperately looking to sell it, could not find it. And one day he came to my folks' house after this house had been empty, and he said, "Would you mind if a Negro family moved in? Because I can't sell it to anyone else, and there are probably a lot of Negro people who would like a house like this." And that was really the beginning of this opportunity to integrate Levittown. The Myers family, the Weschler family, and people in the circle met for about a month and a half to talk about what this would mean, how you do it, what the consequences would be. No one had any idea of what would really happen. Mm-hmm. Everyone knew that it would be tense, it would be hard, there would probably be opposition, but no one had any idea that on August 13th, 1957, the day the Myers took ownership of the home, the mailman came to deliver the mail and knocked on the front door, and Daisy answered the door, and he said, "Can I speak to the owner of the house? I have some mail for her." And she said, "I am the owner of the house." And his jaw dropped. And then he came to the next door house, which happened to be mine, and he said, "Hey, the niggers are moving in next door." And he went from house to house to house on the block.
Post office.
The mailman. And he delivered the mail, or the message, that a Negro family had moved in at 43 Deep Green Lane. Within 2 hours, my sister and I were home. It was summertime. My sister's 4 years older than me. I was 10 years old at this time. 10 years old, a really impressionable time. And cars started circling the block and staring and going around and around the block. And by 3 in the afternoon, there was a constant stream of people walking in front of our house, driving in front of our house, looking and pointing at the house. By that night, there was a mob of 300 people in front of the house.
From actually Levittown, or people from outside?
Well, it started both Levittown, but people from outside came because word spread very fast. There was an article in that evening newspaper announcing the integration of Levittown and thankfully giving the address so that everyone could find us.
Well, let me just ask, what was the legal ramification on this, since it was in the covenant of the, you know, if you owned a house in Levittown, you couldn't sell it to a non-white?
Yeah, they were breaking the rules of Levittown, but Levittown was breaking the rules of the law because there had been a Supreme Court case before that said you could not discriminate in housing. But you know, laws are made to be tested, not to be followed. So that's what was going on there. The mob actually took hold that night, and I can remember as a 10-year-old looking out the front window of my house and seeing people screaming and shouting and throwing fists in the air and middle fingers at us. And I could see the mother of friends of mine that I used to play with every day calling us nigger lover Jews, and just red in the face with anger. And I can really remember at that time learning about good and bad, right and wrong, and picking sides, and trying to figure out the courage it takes to be in a minority and in opposition. The crowds would grow day after day, and around the second or third, no, it was actually the first night, someone threw a stone and broke the window of the Myers home. The Myers had not moved into the house yet. They were there to clean up. They lived about 3 miles away, and after they left, a stone was thrown and broke in the front windows. And that was the first stone of violence that happened. The mobs continued week after week, night after night, and they would grow in size. And before long, it was clear that the Ku Klux Klan was in town, because you would feel the reign of terror. And anyone who supported the Myers in any way would start getting phone calls at night We would get phone calls all day long. The Myers would get phone calls all day long. And there would be two kinds of phone calls. One would be threats and insults, and the other would be calls of support.
Okay, yeah.
But the phones were ringing constantly. This was 1957, so we didn't have email or internet. People actually had to call you up. We didn't have answering machines, so you had to actually pick up the phone to see if it was a family friend or a neighbor calling, or if it was someone calling to threaten you. Both the Myers and the Wexlers got death threats on the phone, got insults on the phone, and mail started pouring in from around the world with both letters of support and letters of hate. These are the kinds of things that a 10-year-old remembers of being locked in his house and having a mob day after day outside, and a mob inside of support. I can remember newspaper reporters coming from around the country, TV reporters, Huntley Brinkley News, big news on during that time, came into our house, came into the Myers house, filmed the Myers, filmed the Wexlers. And this is the kind of event that really incites you to think about, well, what is it that America cares about and how does America respond? Things did progress, they did get worse. The police were no help at all. The police actually could not disperse the crowd, even though they tried to disperse the crowd. And on the second or third night of the mob rule in front of our home, the Board of Commissioners sent a telegram to the governor, leader of Pennsylvania, requesting the state police to come, and the telegram said, the people of Levittown are out of control, which was another way of saying, we will not control the people of Levittown, because the police never would do anything to intervene. And when the state police came in, they dispersed the crowd, but that's all they would do. And they provided no protection. They were there 24 hours a day and provided no protection at all. During that time, and over a period of time, reaching into late September, crosses were burned on my front lawn in Levittown, on the lawns of about 5 or 6 neighbors. There was one morning we woke up, and during the time that there was state police protection, there was a KKK painted on the side of our house, and a letter was posted next to the KKK, and I'll just read it to you. Dear Mr. Weschler, it's comforting, I know, to want to believe that the cross burned on your lawn was a childish prank. It was purposely and crudely constructed, and it was put there to let you know that although the crowds have diminished, the feeling against you has not, nor ever will be. We are members of an organization that was born in the South. It is legal and it is chartered. Need I say more? Believe me, Mr. W., I would take off for parts unknown. We are not an organization of terror, as is commonly stated, but rather one with ideals, what we believe are just and right. We are American citizens, not commies or riffraff, and we're fighting and will continue to fight for what we believe to be our constitutional right. Think long and think carefully, Mr. W. Pull out while you can. We have the facts and we're going to use them to our fullest advantage. Signed, a citizen born in the USA, a member of a legal chartered organization.
Nick Weschler, what happened and how long did it take? What is Levittown like today? And then I want to ask you about Paul Robeson.
Sure. You mentioned Little Rock. So Levittown was integrated on August 13th. Little Rock was integrated on September 16th. So it was just weeks after what happened in Levittown. And immediately people made the association between Levittown and Little Rock, both a positive association and a negative association. And a lot of the mail changed and said, you ought to get what they're getting in Little Rock here in Levittown. That's what you deserve. After the reign of terror continued for about 2 months, a group of people, Peter Von Bloom, a Quaker family that was involved, who had a cross burned on his lawn, my folks, and the Myers went to Harrisburg, the state capital, to talk to the Attorney General. And on the car ride on the way up there, my father talked with the Myers family and with Peter, and they said, they're not doing anything to protect us, so let's put them in a position where they have to do something. And these were liberal politicians, and they said, all 3 of us are going to move out of Levittown, and we're going to say we're moving because the state will not protect us. And that strategy actually worked. And shortly after that, the state police came back. They were 24-hour guards again. They didn't do anything. The citizens had to guard both the Wexlers and the Myers because the police wouldn't. But shortly after that, arrests were issued. People were arrested for the cross burning, for the painting of the house, for harassing the Myers and their friends. And eventually there was an injunction put into place that named 7 people, and it listed the acts of terror that had been taking place. And it said, if any acts, including cross-burning, insulting, harassment, take place to the Myers or their supporters, you 7 will be sent to jail immediately. And suddenly things calmed down.
Levittown today, is it an integrated community?
Oh, it's really integrated. 2.45% is African American.
2.4.
2.4%.
Not too much, but...
And of course the fears were if you let one African American family in, the whole town will turn black, and that just doesn't happen.
You know, you can, people listening to the Live from the Heartland show this morning want to know more about Nick Weschler and his dad, Louis Weschler. There's a book available at the Heartland General Store, The First Stone, a memoir of the racial integration of Levittown, Pennsylvania. And you know, this brings up a lot of things I'd love to talk about. Maybe we'll have you back. We'll talk about more stuff. We will run out of time. I want to make 2 announcements, and then if we have time, we'll talk about Paul Robeson. I want to let people know that on August 11th in 1976, the Heartland Cafe was opened its doors, and we will celebrate our 36th birthday on August 11th, coming up real soon. And on August 12th, we are going to have a 5K run. This is the Heartland Heat of the Summer run. So if you need more information on that, go to heartlandcafe.com. One of the most active people, a wonderful American, Paul Robeson. He came to Levittown.
He didn't come to Levittown.
But you met him?
Well, I met him several times as a young person, and then in the late 50s, he gave a concert in Harlem right before he got back his passport so he could travel, and it was a farewell concert. He sang at Carnegie Hall one night, and the next Sunday he's standing in his brother's church in Harlem. And my family went to the concert, and we were taken backstage to greet him afterwards. And he said, "Oh, I know you very well. Thank you very much for what you're doing for America. We'd love to send greetings to Mrs. Myers and her family."
I have a big picture of Paul Robeson with members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Was given to me by my adopted brother, and he got it out of Poughkeepsie, New York, where, you know, Robeson had been attacked by the Klan.
My dad was part of the patrol trying to protect Robeson that day.
So we are going to take out today. We're going to go out with a Paul Robeson tune. I want to thank everybody who made this possible. Listen to the Live from the Heartland every Saturday morning, and do good in the world. The world needs all the good that you do. Give us a little Robeson, and before we hear some more gospel music.